On the eve of the voyage that would change the course of world history, the Atlantic Ocean separated two worlds that knew nothing of each other. Across this vast expanse, civilizations on both sides had flourished, evolved, and shaped their destinies for millennia. In the east, Europe was awakening from centuries of transformation, its kingdoms restless and ambitious. In the west, the continents of the Americas teemed with a dazzling diversity of societies, some ancient and enigmatic, others young and vibrant, all untouched by the gaze of the Old World. When Columbus set sail in 1492, neither he nor his sponsors could have fully grasped the magnitude of what awaited, nor the complex tapestry of cultures they would soon encounter. Long before European sails appeared on the horizon, the Americas were home to peoples whose ancestors, as most scholars believe, crossed the Beringia land bridge from Asia thousands of years earlier. Over countless generations, these migrants and their descendants spread across two vast continents, adapting to every imaginable landscape, from the icy reaches of the Arctic to the sweltering jungles of the Amazon, from mountain highlands to river valleys and coastal plains. By 1492, the population of the Americas may have reached as high as 60 million, spread over an immense patchwork of societies, languages, and traditions. In Mesoamerica and the Andes, the achievements of civilization stood in stone and memory. The Maya, whose great cities had already begun to decline before the arrival of Europeans, left behind pyramids, palaces, and a complex system of writing that chronicled their rulers and gods. Their mathematical skill and astronomical observations rivaled those of any contemporary society. To the north, the Aztec Empire was at the height of its power, governing a vast territory from the shimmering island city of Tenochtitlan. This capital, built on a lake and connected by causeways and aqueducts, bustled with markets and temples, its streets crowded with merchants, priests, and emissaries from distant lands. Farther south, the Inca Empire stretched along the spine of the Andes, a marvel of organization and engineering. From their capital at Cusco, Inca rulers commanded a vast realm linked by an intricate network of roads and bridges. Terraced fields clung to mountain slopes, and storehouses brimmed with maize and potatoes, the fruits of a long agricultural revolution that had transformed life across the Americas. Other societies, such as the Mississippian mound builders, the Pueblo peoples of the Southwest, and the Iroquois Confederacy in the forests of the Northeast, each developed distinctive forms of governance, spirituality, and artistry. While some of these civilizations had faded or transformed before the first European sails appeared, others thrived and would soon be documented, sometimes admiringly, often tragically, by those who arrived. The indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, including the Taino and Carib, would be among the first to encounter the newcomers. Their societies, too, reflected centuries of migration, adaptation, and innovation. Despite persistent myths, the Americas before Columbus were not peaceful utopias. Intertribal politics, shifting alliances, and conflicts were as much a part of life as trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. These were not primitive societies, but ones shaped by complexity, ingenuity, and resilience. Europe, meanwhile, was itself in the midst of profound change. The late 15th century was an age of kingdoms and city-states, of rising monarchies and shifting borders. Spain, newly unified by the conquest of Granada in 1492, was eager to assert itself among the powers of Europe. Portugal, meanwhile, had been quietly building a maritime empire along the coasts of Africa. The drive for wealth, the lure of distant markets, and the promise of glory fueled a restless energy among Europe's rulers and adventurers. For centuries, Europeans had coveted the riches of the East, spices, silks, and precious stones that arrived by perilous overland routes stretching from China and India through Central Asia to the Mediterranean. These routes, always long and dangerous, had become even more uncertain with the rise of powerful empires in the Middle East and the closing of key land passages. The old order was changing, and with it, the possibilities for trade and exploration. Against this backdrop, a new idea began to take shape. Might it be possible to reach Asia by sailing west, across the uncharted Atlantic? This question burned in the mind of Christopher Columbus, a Genoese mariner whose ambitions were as grand as his plans were controversial. He was not the only one to dream of distant lands. Other explorers and thinkers had speculated about lands beyond the Western Sea, but he was among the first to secure royal backing for such a voyage. The Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, fresh from their victory in Granada, agreed to sponsor Columbus's expedition, hoping to claim a share of whatever wealth or glory might lie beyond the horizon. Yet it was not simply the promise of riches that spurred this age of exploration. Religion, too, played a powerful role. The Catholic monarchs saw themselves as defenders of Christendom, eager not only to expand their territories but also to spread the Christian faith. The mingling of these motives, wealth, competition, and religious zeal was characteristic of the period. Mercantilist ideas, which held that national power depended on the accumulation of gold and silver, began to influence European policy. The search for new trade routes, new markets, and new sources of wealth became a driving force for monarchs and merchants alike. None of this would have been possible without remarkable advances in maritime technology. For centuries, European sailors had hugged the coastlines, relying on familiar landmarks and simple navigation. But the 15th century saw the development of ships and tools that would make long-distance voyages feasible, if still perilous. The caravel, a nimble vessel with triangular sails, could tack against the wind and survive rough seas. The carrack, larger and sturdier, was built to carry heavy loads and withstand the open ocean. Columbus's own fleet included two caravels, the Niña and the Pinta, and a larger carrack, the Santa Maria, all fitted out in the port of Palos, Spain. Equally transformative were the tools of navigation. European mariners learned to use the magnetic compass to determine direction, the astrolabe and cross-staff to measure the height of celestial bodies, and portolan charts, detailed maps of coastlines and harbors to plot their courses. These innovations, combined with the method of dead reckoning, allowed sailors to venture farther from land than ever before. While navigation remained an uncertain art and the Atlantic was still a realm of mystery and fear, the boundaries of the known world had begun to expand. On the eve of Columbus's voyage, the Old World's view of geography was still shaped by ancient authorities and limited experience. Most Europeans believed the world was round, but estimates of its size varied widely. The prevailing assumption was that only 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, existed, separated by an encircling ocean. The possibility of unknown lands to the west was entertained by some, but there was no clear knowledge of the vast continents that lay across the sea. In this sense, 1492 truly marked a watershed moment, the beginning of sustained contact between societies that had developed in isolation from each other for thousands of years. The motivations for exploration were complex and intertwined. The rise of absolute monarchies in Europe created powerful patrons willing to invest in risky ventures. The Renaissance, with its spirit of inquiry and rediscovery of ancient knowledge, encouraged curiosity about the wider world. Advances in mathematics and cartography provided explorers with new tools for understanding and representing the globe. The promise of trade and wealth, the desire for religious expansion, and the competition between emerging European states all contributed to a climate of ambition and adventure. Yet for all their ingenuity, European explorers remained largely ignorant of the peoples and civilizations they would encounter. The Americas were not blank spaces awaiting discovery, but continents filled with their own stories, struggles, and achievements. Indigenous records, where they survived, offered glimpses of these worlds, of rulers and warriors, farmers and artisans, priests and poets. Much was lost in the upheaval that followed, but much also endures in the ruins of cities, in oral traditions, and in the descendants of those who greeted the ships from across the sea. As Columbus prepared to depart, the world stood poised between 2 eras. In the Americas, established societies continued their cycles of feasting and fasting, trade and war, worship and work, unaware of the approaching storm. In Europe, the sails of 3 small ships symbolized a new phase in the human story, one of exploration, encounter, and, ultimately, transformation. The voyage of 1492 did not begin a simple tale of discovery, but a complex, often tragic, meeting of worlds, each rich in its own history, each forever changed by the crossing of the ocean. The story of Columbus's arrival is thus not just the tale of a single man or a single voyage, but the culmination of centuries of movement, invention, and aspiration on both sides of the Atlantic. It is a story shaped by the ambitions of kings and the dreams of navigators, by the resilience of indigenous peoples and the unfolding of empires. As historians continue to revisit and reconsider this pivotal moment, the need to understand the world as it was, complex, diverse, and interconnected, remains as vital as ever. And so, on the eve of discovery, the stage was set for a new chapter in the shared history of humanity, a chapter whose consequences would echo across continents and centuries to come. In the pre-dawn darkness of August 14, 1492, as the moon hung low over the waters, 3 ships slipped quietly out of the harbor and into the unknown. Their destination, in the minds of their leader and his royal patrons, was the fabled riches of Asia, reached not by the familiar routes along Africa and the Indian Ocean, but by striking boldly west across the vast Atlantic. Christopher Columbus, the Genoese mariner with an unshakable conviction that the world was smaller than most believed, carried not only the hopes of his crew but also the ambitions of a newly unified Spanish crown. The journey that unfolded in the months that followed was as harrowing as it was improbable. Columbus's journal, a daily record of his thoughts and observations, reveals a man both driven and devout who saw his mission as intertwined with faith and fortune. He sailed under a royal commission that outlined not just the practicalities of the voyage, but also its spiritual aims, to bring new lands and peoples into the fold of Christianity. The shadow of the Reconquista, the recent expulsion of Muslim rule from Spain, loomed over his mission, infusing it with a sense of holy purpose. Promised titles, privileges, and a share of any wealth he might find, Columbus also bore the solemn charge to convert any new peoples to Christianity. The Atlantic crossing itself tested endurance and will. For weeks, the ships pressed on through swells and storms, their course plotted with the latest navigational tools. Yet as days stretched into weeks and the western horizon remained empty, doubts began to gnaw at the crew. Columbus recorded moments of near mutiny, when fear and uncertainty threatened to overwhelm the discipline of the expedition. He soothed his men with optimistic estimates and strong leadership, never wavering in his outward confidence, even as anxiety surely crept into his own heart. Stubborn hope and gnawing doubt played out beneath the endless sky as sailors cast nervous glances at the fading memory of home. Then, on October 12, 1492, after more than a month at sea, the lookout on the Pinta sighted land. Columbus named the island San Salvador, though its Lucayan inhabitants called it Guanahani. He believed he had reached one of the islands off the coast of Asia, perhaps Japan or the Indies, an assumption he never quite relinquished. The reality, as history would reveal, was altogether different, but in that moment, celebration and relief eclipsed any distinction. The crew waded ashore, planting the Spanish banner in the sandy soil and claiming the land for Ferdinand and Isabella. The first encounters between Columbus and the indigenous peoples were cautious and filled with mutual curiosity. The Taino, who lived on Guanahani and throughout the surrounding islands, greeted the newcomers with a mixture of wonder and openness. Columbus's writings describe the Taino as generous and gentle, offering gifts of parrots, cotton, and small trinkets. He marveled at their lack of weapons and armor, noting that they carried only simple spears, often tipped with fishbone. To Columbus, this apparent vulnerability suggested both innocence and an opportunity for easy conquest. In his reports to Ferdinand and Isabella, he wrote that with a handful of men he could subjugate the entire population, a reflection of the imperial mindset he carried across the ocean. Yet the Taino were far from defenseless in their own world. Their society, though unfamiliar to the Europeans, was complex and deeply rooted in the Caribbean environment. They cultivated crops, built canoes, and maintained networks of kinship and alliance that stretched across the islands. Columbus, seeing only what fit his expectations, described them as living in a kind of Edenic simplicity, ripe for conversion to Christianity. The gift exchanges that marked these early meetings were fraught with misunderstanding. The Spanish considered their offerings of glass beads and bells to be treasures, while the Taino reciprocated with objects of local value, perhaps not grasping the hierarchical weight the Europeans attached to such tokens. Columbus's journal is filled with observations that shift between admiration and calculation. He noted the Taino's curiosity about European clothing, their eagerness to trade, and their willingness to swim out to the ships, sometimes in large numbers. He saw these qualities as signs of malleability, evidence that they would make good servants and could be easily converted, echoing the dual motives of exploitation and evangelization that defined his mission. The instructions he carried from the Spanish monarchs emphasized the importance of both securing wealth and spreading the Christian faith, two goals that would, in time, come into tragic conflict. In the days that followed, the expedition sailed along the coasts of other islands, what Columbus believed to be parts of the Asian mainland. He explored Cuba and Hispaniola, recording every river, bay, and promontory with a mixture of wonder and proprietary zeal. The scale of what he had encountered eluded him. Instead of the wealthy courts of Asia, he found communities whose riches were measured in cassava bread and gold ornaments worn as nose rings or bracelets. The Spanish, hungry for gold, questioned the Taino about its sources, and Columbus's journal records his persistent inquiries, often met with gestures and words he could not decipher. The language barrier, coupled with the eagerness of both sides to impress and appease, led to a swirl of misconceptions. The Taino may have pointed inland or to distant islands in response to queries about gold, hoping to satisfy their guests or perhaps to encourage their departure. As the months wore on, the initial atmosphere of curiosity began to give way to suspicion and tension. Columbus, determined to establish a foothold for Spain, left a small contingent on Hispaniola to form a colony while he prepared for the return voyage. His letters to the monarchs painted a picture of abundant opportunity, fertile lands, docile peoples, and the promise of untold wealth. News of his discoveries, carried back across the ocean, spread quickly through Europe, igniting imaginations and ambitions. The publication of his reports, often embellished or misinterpreted, helped fuel a wave of subsequent voyages. Yet even in these first encounters, the seeds of future conflict were sown. Columbus's insistence on the potential for servitude, his fixation on gold, and his assumptions about the nature and value of the people he met would shape the policies and actions of those who followed. The Taino, for their part, could not have foreseen the storm that was about to break upon their world. Their hospitality, interpreted by Columbus as weakness or simplicity, masked a society with its own traditions, hierarchies, and histories, none of which could withstand the unprecedented pressures that European colonization would bring. The fate of the Lucayan people, who first greeted Columbus on San Salvador, offers a somber footnote to these early days of contact. In the years that followed, the population of the Bahamas would be devastated by disease, enslavement, and violence, their numbers reduced dramatically within a generation. The encounters that began with cautious exchanges of gifts and gestures of welcome would soon give way to exploitation and tragedy, a pattern repeated across the Caribbean and, eventually, the continents beyond. Throughout his writings, Columbus returned again and again to the themes of conversion and conquest. He saw himself as an agent of providence, fulfilling a divine commission to bring new souls into the orbit of Christendom. The context of his mission, the recent triumph of Christian Spain over Muslim Granada, the royal instructions to seek both spiritual and material gain, framed every decision he made. Yet his journals also reveal moments of uncertainty, as when he struggled to interpret the words and gestures of the Taino, or when he speculated about the nature of the lands he had found. Was this truly Asia, or something altogether new? The question would haunt Europe for decades, as explorers and monarchs scrambled to understand and exploit the lands across the Atlantic. The story of Columbus's first voyage is not merely a tale of daring navigation or chance discovery. It is a record of expectations colliding with reality, of cultures meeting under unequal circumstances, and of the profound misunderstandings that shaped the encounter. Columbus's belief that he had reached the fringes of Asia colored every report he sent home, every interaction with the people he met. His accounts, published and circulated throughout Europe, became the foundation for new myths and ambitions, even as the realities on the ground grew more complex and contested. The consequences of these first encounters were not fully apparent in those early months. For the Taino, the arrival of strange ships and men marked the beginning of a new era, one that would bring unimaginable change, suffering, and loss. For Columbus and his patrons, it was the opening of a door onto a world of possibility, both sacred and profane. The interplay of curiosity and misunderstanding, generosity and exploitation would define the century that followed. Columbus set sail hoping to find a new route to Asia, but what he found instead was a world both familiar and alien, inhabited by peoples with their own histories and dreams. The first encounters were shaped by expectation, necessity, and the limits of understanding. As the ships turned homeward, bearing news of lands and peoples unknown to Europe, neither side could yet fathom the scale of the transformation that had begun. The voyage of 1492 would echo across the centuries, its legacy as complex and contested as the meeting itself. When Columbus's ships left the Caribbean behind and set their course for Spain, few could have imagined the tidal wave of change already set in motion. The world's hemispheres, once separated by thousands of years of unbroken isolation, became suddenly and inextricably linked. This was not a meeting of equals, but a collision of worlds with consequences that would ripple across continents and centuries. In those first moments of contact, the seeds of transformation, ecological, biological, cultural, and economic, were sown, and their harvest would prove both bountiful and devastating. The most immediate and far-reaching result of Columbus's arrival was what historians call the Columbian Exchange, the vast ongoing interchange of plants, animals, people, and microbes between the Old World and the New. It is difficult now to fully imagine the world before this exchange. When the potato was unknown in Ireland, horses did not thunder across the North American plains, and tomatoes had never graced an Italian table. Yet, in the wake of those first landfalls, such boundaries were swept aside. Europeans brought with them an array of domesticated animals, horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats that had never before set hoof in the Americas. These animals transformed landscapes and ways of life. Horses, in particular, would eventually become central to the cultures of many indigenous peoples, though their spread took generations and, in some places, followed after the initial devastation of disease and conquest. Cattle and pigs, left to roam, multiplied rapidly, altering fields and forests and sometimes crowding out native species. The introduction of these animals brought new sources of food and labor, but also new challenges, as indigenous farming methods adapted or sometimes failed to adapt to their presence. Crops, too, made the journey in both directions. From the Americas, maize, potatoes, sweet potatoes, tomatoes, beans, and cacao traveled eastward, finding fertile ground in Europe, Africa, and Asia. The introduction of the potato to Europe, for instance, would one day help fuel population booms and stave off starvation, while maize became a staple from Spain to the Balkans. In return, Europeans introduced wheat, rice, barley, oats, and sugarcane to the Americas. These crops reshaped diets and agricultural practices, sometimes enriching, sometimes undermining local traditions. Sugarcane, in particular, became the engine of vast new plantations, an economic transformation with consequences far beyond the fields where it grew. Yet it was not only seeds and livestock that crossed the ocean. Invisible and unbidden, a host of old-world diseases also made the journey. The Americas had been isolated for so long that their peoples had no previous exposure and therefore no immunity to many deadly viruses and bacteria. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus swept through indigenous communities with terrifying speed and lethality. Epidemics erupted in wave after wave, sometimes following in the footsteps of explorers and conquistadors, sometimes racing ahead of them, carried silently by infected travelers or trade goods. The scale of suffering almost defies comprehension. By 1650, estimates suggest that between 50 and as much as 95% of the pre-contact indigenous population of the Americas had perished from disease. Some regions saw catastrophic losses more quickly than others. In places such as Central California, the worst depopulation began after sustained contact rather than immediately following Columbus's landing, but the overall effect was the same. By some calculations, the indigenous population across the Americas fell from tens of millions to about 6 million by the year 1700. For the peoples of the Caribbean, such as the Taino, the loss was near total. The islands that had been home to vibrant societies became, within decades, nearly empty landscapes, their survivors scattered or enslaved. The impact of disease cannot be separated from the wider story of conquest and colonization. Epidemics weakened indigenous communities, undermining their capacity to resist European encroachment or adapt to new conditions. Sometimes, the arrival of disease preceded the arrival of soldiers, softening the ground for conquest. In other instances, the chaos and loss wrought by disease made traditional forms of governance, trade, and agriculture impossible to sustain. The very fabric of daily life, birth, marriage, leadership, worship, was torn apart. In the wake of this great dying, as some historians call it, the social and cultural worlds of the Americas were forever altered, but the Columbian Exchange was not a one-way street. Just as old-world diseases decimated indigenous populations, the flow of American crops and ideas changed Europe and the wider world. The adoption of maize, potatoes, and other American crops helped support burgeoning populations on other continents. These new foods offered nutritional diversity and could thrive in soils and climates where traditional old-world staples sometimes failed. Over time, the diets, economies, and even the cuisines of Europe, Africa, and Asia became entwined with the bounty of the Americas. Chocolate, once the ritual drink of Mesoamerican elites, became a luxury and then a staple of European society. Tobacco, too, entered global commerce, with consequences both profitable and addictive. As the Old and New worlds became more closely linked, the exchange of people also intensified. The initial colonists were soon followed by missionaries, traders, and fortune seekers. In their wake, and crucially, as a result of the economic systems established in the colonies, came the forced migration of millions. The rise of plantation agriculture, particularly the cultivation of sugarcane, fueled the demand for labor that could not be met by the dwindling indigenous population. The catastrophic loss of native peoples led European colonists to turn to Africa, initiating the transatlantic slave trade. Thus, the Columbian Exchange set in motion not only ecological and demographic transformations, but also new systems of exploitation and forced migration whose legacies still shape the modern world. The environments of both hemispheres were transformed. In the Americas, the introduction of European livestock and crops reshaped fields, forests, and grasslands, sometimes creating new ecological balances and sometimes causing erosion, deforestation, and the loss of native species. In Europe, The cultivation of American crops changed agricultural practices and land use, offering new options for farmers and new sources of wealth for landowners. The global connections forged in the wake of Columbus's voyage ushered in an era of globalization where goods, people, and ideas moved across oceans with unprecedented speed. The consequences of contact were thus not only biological or ecological, but profoundly cultural and social. New languages and religions spread across the Americas, introduced by missionaries and settlers. Indigenous systems of knowledge and belief were often suppressed, sometimes violently, but also persisted in new forms woven into the fabric of colonial society. The very concept of encounter moments of meeting, misunderstanding, and transformation across difference became central to the history of the Americas. Both Old and New World societies were remade, not by simple replacement, but by ongoing processes of adaptation, resistance, and reinvention. For those who survived, the legacies of contact were complex. Some indigenous peoples found ways to endure, adapting to new realities by forming alliances, adopting new technologies, or moving to less accessible regions. Others were dispersed, enslaved, or absorbed into colonial societies. The memory of loss and resilience would echo through generations, shaping identities and histories well into the future. Europe, too, was transformed by the encounter. The wealth generated by American crops, precious metals, and new trade routes fueled the rise of powerful nation-states. Economic and demographic shifts accelerated as populations grew and cities expanded. The very idea of the world, its size, its peoples, its possibilities, changed forever. The arrival of Columbus marked, in the eyes of some historians, the beginning of modernity, an age defined by exploration, exploitation, and the forging of a truly interconnected world. Yet, for all its transformative power, the encounter between the Old and New Worlds was marked by profound inequalities. The benefits of the Columbian Exchange, new foods, animals, and technologies, were unevenly distributed. The costs, measured in lives lost and cultures disrupted, fell most heavily on the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Epidemic diseases, introduced livestock, and the imposition of colonial rule reshaped entire continents. The near extinction of some Caribbean peoples and dramatic declines elsewhere stand as enduring reminders of the human toll. Scholars point out that the legacy of Columbus's arrival cannot be captured by any single narrative. It is a story of catastrophe and creation, of loss and transformation. The world that emerged from 1492 was unrecognizable to those who lived on either side of the Atlantic before that fateful voyage. The consequences of contact, ecological, demographic, economic, and cultural, continue to shape lives and landscapes today. In the centuries since Columbus's landfall, debates have raged over how to remember and interpret his legacy. Some have cast him as a visionary explorer, others as a harbinger of conquest and suffering. What is clear, however, is that his arrival marked the beginning of a new era, one in which the destinies of peoples and continents became intertwined. The legacies of contact, visible in the foods we eat, the languages we speak, and the histories we inherit, are all around us, reminders of a moment when two worlds collided and neither was ever the same again.